And of course, the bulk of that 35,000 women and children. Let's get you some analysis on what's set to unfold at The Hague in 25 minutes' time. Daniel Levy is the president of the US Middle East Project, and he joins us now for more. Daniel, it's good to talk to you. Thanks very much for talking to us from London. How much will this decision mean today, one way or another, whichever way it goes, when the Israeli government says, quote unquote, no power on earth will stop us?
It's a very good question. And we have seen Israel ignore the provisional measures ruling made by the International Court of Justice in its first response to the South African submission. And as we know, unlike a national court of law, the international legal system, the International Court of Justice, and indeed the International Criminal Court, which made a quite important announcement earlier in the week, does not have an enforcement mechanism at its disposal. But that is not, therefore, to dismiss the significance of this, because I think this is important for people to wrap their heads around, and it's difficult, because you expect that if this is a court saying something, well, then it has to be adhered to. Mm-hmm. And that should be the case. It isn't the case. What this does is when you have a situation of violations of international law, of ongoing criminality, not just of course, what was done to Israelis on October 7th, what was done by Israel to Palestinians every day since, but also for decades prior to that. So when you have an ongoing situation of criminality, and crucially, when that has been enabled by the offending party being able to build layer upon layer of impunity, the way you change things is it's not a silver bullet. It's not one ruling of a court. It is you undo that impunity layer by layer until the cost for continuing the criminality becomes something that causes that society to reconsider. And I'm talking to you there in South Africa, and people have a historic memory, and people who weren't around then no doubt have studied that. That system was undone not by one court decision, one UN vote, one boycotting decision. It was done layer by layer until things were reconsidered. And so that is, I would say, the more important context in which to view the South African case, in which to view today's potential decision, and the follow-up to it. In that respect, when it comes to undoing the layers of impunity, this is very significant because it also puts under the spotlight not just Israel, but those who continue to supply the arms and enable this internationally.
And South Africans will argue and will respond to that discussion around apartheid and say it was such a stunning project that the effects of apartheid continue to this day in South Africa, even though we are living in a democracy now. But Daniel, there have been so many developments just in the past couple of weeks, right? Countries like Germany saying that they will effect an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas leaders if indeed the ICC prosecutors are successful in seeking those arrest warrants. Countries saying that they recognize a Palestinian state, more and more countries coming forward. All of these things make the Israel case harder to prove.
You are absolutely right. And let me just acknowledge and appreciate the comment you made. And unfortunately, regarding South African history and contemporary reality. And unfortunately, that's going to be true in the Palestine-Israel expanse. What has happened to Palestinians does not get undone, even when the fundamental dispensation gets switched. But you are right. This is quite a monumental, even consequential week with the decision, the call by the chief prosecutor for arrest warrants, which will now be considered by the International Criminal Court. So when it comes to this question of how does one accumulate a challenge to the status quo, a different incentive structure for the violating party, in this case Israel, a different cost-benefit calculation, we may well historically look back on this week and say that was a really important week. And these things feed into each other. So the recognition didn't happen in a vacuum. I would argue that the International Criminal Court request for the arrest warrants did not happen in a vacuum either. And I would go as far as to say that were it not for the South African case at the ICJ, I don't think there would have been as much pressure on the ICC to act, because the current chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, has really been cautious and dragged his feet in trying to avoid this subject. There was a historic case being considered by the ICC that relates to the ongoing criminality of the occupation prior to October 7th. So, again, this doesn't mean that the reality changes tomorrow, but it does mean that whether it's Israel itself or it's those who are trying to do two impossible things at the same time, namely to stand with Israel despite what it is doing, and to uphold an international legal system, because that's the cost here, the cost to the United States, the cost to Western allies of Israel to run cover for Israel. That has just experienced a massive inflation. The cost for that has exponentially gone up because you are losing credibility in the world. Maybe you've lost it already. You're losing these already fragile international structures, and those things matter also. You know, the longer, I would just say this, the longer the impunity goes on, the more Israel actually is encouraged down a path of hubris and arrogance and more extremism. So I would, humbly suggest that for Israelis as well, impunity is a really bad thing. And the war itself is not going well, because that's the other thing that's happened. You have these fights inside the Israeli cabinet, the defense minister and the prime minister, both now facing arrest warrants from the ICC, at each other's throats, playing a blame game. And the blame game happens when there's failure, not success.
Daniel, I know this has to be our last question because we have a minute left with you, but is there room here? I mean, can we even talk about getting around a table and talking?
We always can, and we should. And even if those circumstances are not propitious and it's not going to happen tomorrow, we have to build towards that moment. And that means a few things. First of all, you've got to have the people who are quarreling, the people who are in the midst of a wicked conflict around that table. The Palestinians will need to rebuild their structures and include, difficult as it is, include Hamas. Believe you me, the Palestinians have as little desire to sit with the Israelis as the Israelis do to sit with anybody that includes Hamas. But that is where this will eventually end up. And crucially, the more that ordinary citizens redouble their efforts to push for the challenging of this impunity, and the more that states use the power and the tools at their disposal, as I want to acknowledge this, as South Africa has, the closer we will get to that moment.
Daniel Levy.